Hi, everybody. It's Professor Loan, and this week we will be talking about three plant families, Apiaceae, Ranunculaceae, and Caprifoliaceae, and we'll be going over one species from each of these families, and you can find the associated page numbers at the top of the slide. So the Apiaceae family can typically be characterized by their umbel-shaped flowers or compound umbelled flowers. In fact, the family used to be called Umbelliferae for those flower types before it was renamed to Apiaceae. And that's because the inflorescences are umbel, and specifically they're compound umbels, or an umbel of umbels. And so here's a simple umbel where you can see the peduncle here, and then you can see the involucre here, and then you see these rays here that hold these flowers that are on this overall umbel. They're arranged as an umbel. And so you can kind of see umbel like umbrella. And then here's a compound umbel where there are several of these, and there are essentially this simple umbel is compounded multiple times off a single peduncle. And so here's an example of a real live plant. So again, here's the peduncle, which is kind of like this appendage that holds a compound flower to its plant. And then this plant has an involucre. So that's kind of a set of modified leaves whorled around where the kind of inflorescences come out of the peduncle. And then they have these individual ray stems that basically connect it to the umbellets. And these umbellets are these kind of simple umbels that make up the compound umbels. And these little stems on the simple umbels are called pedicels, or essentially the stem that holds the little flowers. So with the Apiaceae family, we're going to be focusing on Conium maculatum, or poison hemlock, which can be found on page 224. Before we get into that, we'll just briefly describe the Apiaceae family a little bit more. It's a very large and diverse family. It is the 16th largest flowering plant family in the world, and it's typically aromatic, which means it's scented or has aromas that you can strongly smell, and it has hollow stems, which is not characteristic of forbs and often characteristic of grass species. However, plants in the Apiaceae family typically have hollow stems, like grasses. They often also have compound umbelled flower arrangements, as you can see on this fennel plant above me, or maybe you can smell it through the photo. The family itself contains many familiar plant species like carrot, celery, angelica, caraway, coriander, cilantro, cumin, dill, fennel, hemlock, which is very poisonous, parsley, cow parsleys and parsnips, and hogweed, and many more. But do not eat wild Apiaceae plants that you do not know, because they are toxic and several of them are highly and painfully poisonous, especially in Humboldt County and across North America. So do not eat it if you don't know what it is. So poison hemlock, or again, Conium maculatum, it's called maculatum because it has spots on the stem, and maculata, or macula, means spotted in Latin, and so that's why it's Conium maculatum. It's a biennial plant that essentially grows its rosettes in the first year and then flowers in the second year, and it's a non-native introduced plant from Europe. It grows as a forb ranging from half a meter to 3 meters tall, so that's almost 10 feet tall, so it gets pretty tall. It grows erect and stout, and so it's pretty sturdy and robust, and it's highly branched. It's a cool season plant that flowers from May to August, and it reproduces primarily from seeds. The inflorescences are convex compound umbels, as again you can see in this photo here, and the convex refers to its kind of convex outward kind of curve. And flowers are typically white and perfect, which means again it has the male and female portions in that one flower, and they're regular, which means they are radially symmetrical. And the fruits are schizocarps, which again, if you forget, that is a dry fruit that splits into single-seeded parts when ripe. And those are broadly ovoid, and they have prominent ribbing along those fruits. So Conia maculatum, or poison hemlock, vegetatively speaking, its leaves are alternate and pinnately compound. So again, alternate means they occur opposite of each other, but they're slightly offset. The divisions in those compound leaves are pinnately incised and broadly ovate, which makes it look like a fern-like leaf, as you can see here. And so you can see the pinnate assemblage of leaves, and that they're compound because the leaflets coming off of that pinnate portion is also pinnately arranged, so that makes it a compound pinnate leaf. And you can see those sharp divisions there and making them broadly ovate. The petioles are sheathing, kind of like what you would expect with celery. And here's an example of the petiole coming out of that stalk being covered by a sheath. And again, if you forget what a petiole is, that is the little stem that connects a leaf to the main part of the plant. Stems are erect from a stout and again hollow taproot and stem. Oftentimes the stems are highly branched and they are both glabrous and glaucous, and so that is smooth, hairless, glabrous. Glaucous is this kind of bluish gray color and can also refer to a powdery residue, as you kind of see on this stem right here. It is purple spotted, which is where it gets its name maculatum from, which is derived from a Latin word that means spotted. And so Conium maculatum can be easily distinguished from other Apiaceae plants by this kind of intense purple spotting on its stems. The internodes are also hollow, like the stems. And in terms of smell, it can be sour or musty or have a mousy odor. Historically speaking, Conium maculatum, or poison hemlock, was not really used because it is poisonous in all parts, except for maybe to put people to death, like Socrates, for example, as some of you may have heard. There was also the Hemlock Society that included some famous names like George Hardin that also used hemlock. And in terms of forage, it has no value of forage for livestock, any class, and it's also not that useful for wildlife because it is very toxic and can cause livestock losses because it contains several alkaloids, which may be in the fruits or the leaves and fruit, and the fruits tend to be the most toxic portion of the plant. Habitat-wise, it occurs in moist soils of pastures and rangelands. It can occur in diverse types of habitats, and especially in disturbed areas like streams and wetter areas like stream banks. Oftentimes, it again kind of enjoys a cooler, moister environment, so it does well in shaded environments, in areas that may be more arid, and it can do fine in open ground and areas that have more moisture, like Humboldt County. And it's pretty common throughout here, so this is why you should not eat Apiaceae plants unless you clearly know what they are, because this could be very bad for you in terms of your health. Next up, we're going to be talking about the Ranunculaceae family, also known as the buttercup family. And specifically, we'll be going over Delphinium bicolor, which can be found on page 388 of your book. The Ranunculaceae family, or the buttercup family, is a large diversified plant family with 43 genres and 2,346 species and counting, and includes very common genres like Delphinium, which you may have seen before, like this blue flower right above me, commonly known as larkspurs. And those are also highly diversified with 365 species and more to be discovered. Plants in the Ranunculaceae family are often valuable for pollinators because oftentimes they have some really great nectaries that you can kind of see in some of these spurs, basically. So Delphinium bicolor, or low larkspur, is a perennial native plant. And in terms of its growth, it's a forb that grows anywhere from 10 to 60 centimeters tall on average, and generally grows erect but can sometimes be weak stemmed, and so it can be a little bit less rigid and a little bit more droopy in terms of its stem. Um, and it's usually unbranched, and so it usually kind of comes up from a central branch or stalk. And it's a cool season plant that flowers from May to July, and the seeds often mature from June to July. And it reproduces primarily from seeds. In terms of its inflorescence, low larkspur or delphinium bicolor has raceme inflorescences that are oblong-shaped and are terminal, which means, again, they occur at the end of that pedicel or stalk. And the racemes typically have 3 to 15 flowers, and the pedicels can be spreading, and so they may be kind of splayed away from each other. And the flowers are perfect and irregular. Irregular flowers are flowers that are bilaterally symmetric and don't have the classic 5 or 6 circular petals that might make them regular flowers, which are radially symmetric. And so irregular flowers are typically bilaterally symmetric, and again, don't kind of follow that kind of classic 5, 6 flower petal that are round and radially symmetric, which makes it regular, quote unquote. And this is very similar to, for example, Fabaceae plants, which are also irregular and bilaterally symmetric. It has 5 sepals, and of the sepals, they can often be petaloid, and so that means those sepals can, even though they are not true petals, they can appear to look like petals. And sepals, if you forget, are often modified leaves at kind of the base of the floral, the inflorescence or flower petals, and could sometimes contribute to creating an involucre. It has a corolla with 2 sets of petals, which includes, again, petals and sepals or petaloid sepals. And the petals are actually smaller than the sepals themselves. And the upper petals are often white or with blue veins, whereas the lower petals are often clawed and blue or purple in color. The fruits themselves are follicle and usually divergent and brown on maturity and many-seeded. And so you can see an example of a seed pod above me that I've circled in red. It's a little green because it is still not ripe, but as it matures, it will turn brown. So for Delphinium bicolor, the leaves are alternate and simple, which again means they're not compound leaves. They are also mostly basal leaves that are evenly spaced. They are often highly dissected, as you can see in this image here. And so here's the dissections. And they're dissected into linear to lanceolate to oblanceolate divisions. And if you're unfamiliar with those terms, revisit the leaf shape drawings in your book, or you can find them as well online. The leaves are glabrate, which means they become glabrous with age, which means, again, glabrous is hairless. The lowest petioles are often long, and then petioles higher up can sometimes be shorter. The stems are hollow, which is not necessarily characteristic of forbs. And the stems are also can range from being glabrous, which is no hair, to finely hairy. And so there's some variation there on the stems. Historically speaking, indigenous tribes used this plant to help control lice and other pest insects. In more recent times, it's been used as an ornamental species because larkspurs, as you could have seen on the previous slides and this slide, can often create some showy flowers that people enjoy. So Delphinium bicolor has fair to good forage for sheep and some wildlife, and is palatable to cattle even when other plants are available, and unpalatable to horses. I do also just want to remind you all that palatability refers to whether an animal will eat that forage or browse. But it does not necessarily mean they should eat it or that it's non-toxic. And that's because Delphinium bicolor can be poisonous to cattle throughout its life cycle. And so even though it is palatable, it can be toxic and not that great of forage. And that's because it contains alkaloids, different alkaloids that basically act on the nervous system, causing paralysis of breathing, and that could even cause death, for example. Eating low larkspur and Delphinium bicolor can also cause bloat, and bloat is a form of indigestion marked by an excessive accumulation of gas in the rumen. And so it's essentially usually removed through belching, but sometimes it can be accumulated and cause health problems and even death in livestock and ruminant livestock. And specifically, the seeds are the most alkaloid heavy part of this plant and the most poisonous part. In terms of habitat, you can see in the map where it's distributed, and it typically occurs in open woods, the roadsides, hills, and meadows, essentially in more open habitats, and can be quite abundant on dry soils. Next up, we're going to be talking about the Carpifoliaceae family, also known as the honeysuckle family. And from this family, you'll be responsible for knowing Symphyiocarpus albus, also known as snowberry, found on page 298. Plants in the Carpifoliaceae family are typically shrubs or vine types of plants. They have opposite leaves characteristically, and if you remember, or means the leaves occur directly opposite from each other on the stem. The flowers themselves are often tubular and funnel-shaped or bell-shaped, and usually it has 5 outward spreading lobes or points. And these flowers can also often be fragrant, and on our campus there are many examples of ornamental species from the honeysuckle family and from the honeysuckle genus called Lonicera. Overall, there's about 180 species found across the world. So snowberry, or Symphyiocarpus albus, is a native perennial species, and it's a cool season shrub that grows up to 1 meter tall, and it typically has few to several stems that come out of a woody base that can also be rhizomatous and essentially form creeping rootstocks and essentially form thickets. And it reproduces from both seeds and rhizomes for that reason, and can also be dispersed through birds. The inflorescences are solitary flowers, which means they might occur on their own, or they could be in short racemes with 2 to 5 flowers, and typically are terminal, which means they occur at the very end of the stalks they occur on. The flowers are perfect and regular, and both of which we've discussed already in this lecture. And it has a calyx with 5 lobes that are often triangular and light green and persistent. If you're unfamiliar or forget what a calyx, here's an example, is essentially fused sepals that kind of create this kind of centralized cup that kind of wrap around the corolla, which is the entirety of all the petals together. Kind of similar to an avuncular, except it is more encompassing and more fused. The corollas themselves are what we call campanulate, which means they are bell-shaped, as you can see in the figure above me. And oftentimes those corollas also have 5 lobes, which again means they kind of go in or dissected slightly, and are whitish to pinkish. The fruits are drupes and ovoid shapes, and they are fleshy and white, and oftentimes they are solitary, or they can be few if they were formed on a racemed flower stalk. And oftentimes a fruit contains 2 nutlets per drupe, and there's 1 seed per nutlet. Vegetatively speaking, the leaves of Symphyiocarpus albus are opposite, which again means they occur on opposite sides of the stem, like you see here, and often are oval to ovate in shape, and are simple, which means they're not compound leaves. They are adaxily dark green. The top side is adaxal, and they are glabrate and leathery, and so that means they become glabrous with age, and they're also leathery in feel length. And abaxillai, as you can see in the top photo, they are pale. Abaxillai, or the back, back abaxillai, can be pale because they are densely pubescent with little white hairs, especially along the veins on the underside. The stems themselves have twigs that are often erect and can support themselves, and are often slender and generally hollow, and vary from yellowish to brown in color. The trunk has thinnish bark, which can be grayish or reddish brown in color, and can sometimes be exfoliating or peel off that stem. Symphyocarpus albus historically was used by indigenous tribes to make tonics from the roots, and also eyewash from the bark, and all parts were crushed to use to treat wounds. Consumption of large quantities of this fruit can often cause vomiting and diarrhea because the saponins in the plant are what we call cathartic, which means they cause digestive movement, and so you may need some Pepto. In terms of its forage value, it can be fair for sheep and goats in the winter, but otherwise is pretty much useless for all other livestock classes, and oftentimes is important food and cover for song and game birds because they really enjoy those beautiful berries, and it's also occasionally browsed by mule deer. Those berries also, because they're so unique and characteristic, often make snowberry a nice ornamental plant that's used across our campus and in other regions as well. In terms of livestock, it can sometimes not be the best for livestock because it contains saponins, which are cathartic. And again, there's two different definitions of cathartic, and we're talking about digestive catharticism, which cause digestive movement, not emotional catharticism. In terms of its habitat, it occurs on wooded hillsides, prairies, and open woodlands. And it can occur in both moist and dry soils. And that will essentially wrap up the 3 plant families and species for this week. Don't forget to comment on your favorite plant family and plant term and why, and I'll see you soon.